Well, with the bells chiming 8 o'clock, I think we should make a start. Thank you very much for coming out this evening and for... We have revolution in the front row here. This is We've got two giggly boys sitting in the church warden's pews. It's wonderful. Thank you very much for coming out. Should we start by praying together? Lord our God, we offer you this evening as we offer you all of ourselves and all of our lives, that we may be moulded, shaped and fashioned for your glory and for the benefit of building your kingdom here on earth. Help us to ensure that this building is a beacon of hope and love, of joy and justice, that all who pass it or come in may glimpse the glory of your kingdom and know themselves to be your beloved children. In the name of Jesus Christ, our Saviour, we pray. Amen. It's particularly good to welcome Dan Talks and Niall Phillips from Purcell, our architects. We will move on to them in about 20 minutes' time. I'm going to start by talking for about 20 minutes on how we got to where we are now. And then after that, Niall and Dan are going to give you a bit of background as to their experience on building new buildings in the context of historic buildings, how they're approaching this particular task. And we're going to end with a little bit of a surprise at the end. There's a little bit of a twist at the end of the evening, which came out last night at a meeting of the project board. So after that, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions as always. So I'm going to start by asking the question, why? Why are we doing this project? Why are we spending so many hours, quite a lot of money, and a huge amount of effort seeking to bring about new facilities for our church? Well, because we need facilities to be a thriving Christian community, a welcoming heritage destination, and an effective parish church. But actually that's not the reason why. To understand the reason why, we need to take a step back from those three outcomes and to step back into that sense of what it is to be a Christian community, what it is to understand that as each individual we have a calling from God to live out that which we have it within us to be, and that what is true for any individual Christian is true too for a Christian community. Why are we engaged in this project? Because we believe it is God's calling on our lives at this point to engage in something which will enable this place to be to become more what it is called to be. Yes, it's important that we think about the facilities. Yes, it's important that we think about our visitors. Yes, it's important that we think about our parish. But primarily and fundamentally, we are called that we might have life and have it in abundance. Not just for us, but for all those who bypass this place, cross its threshold, live within a stone's throw of the door. This is why. It's not what we've got to do. It's not what we're being told to do. It's not what we're being driven to do. It's what we're called to be. And 3 years ago, when I sat down and spoke with most of you and lots of other people as well, we had those individual conversations, if you remember. And those conversations ended by me asking you 2 questions. One was a very informative question just for the moment in history that was then. What is the one thing that you would say to me as I take up my time as vicar of this parish? The other was, what is the purpose of this place? That question was an opportunity for everybody to give voice to their understanding of the calling that God has laid on St Mary Redcliffe, that God is drawing us towards, that God is yearning that we become. To make God in Christ known to the great company of people that is Bristol. To reach out into the local community. To be a beacon, a parish church. There is something very steadying about St Mary Redcliffe and the opportunities that she has to egress out. To be a safe harbour. To be a lively and living witness to the Christian faith in the parish and the city. To create a coherent Christian apologetic for the credibility of faith. That one came from a little bit left field, but it's absolutely bang on the money. One of the things that was said a few years ago about the purpose of those of us who call ourselves Christians and the purpose of churches is to keep the rumour of God alive, to create a coherent Christian apologetic for the credibility of faith, to be a spiritual fitness centre, to proclaim God's kingdom, to enact his kingdom, to live God's kingdom, to bring in the kingdom within our massive sphere of influence. This is what you said to me just a little bit over 3 years ago. These are all different ways of saying the same thing about the calling that we are now really engaging with, as we seek to understand that in order to live into this calling, what we need to become is a thriving Christian community, a welcoming heritage destination, and an effective parish church, meeting some of the needs of some of the people that live in the area. But all that, even those 3 little mantras, roll out of the vision statement that came out of those listening conversations, that listening exercise. And I presented to you 3 years ago, pretty much exactly, the vision statement as I had heard it from you. St Mary Redcliffe is steeped in history, and the people are rightly proud of that heritage, but they are equally clear about where they're going. People blossom in front of you when they talk about their faith. They're passionate about the networks, the groups they are involved with, far beyond the church. The church is focused on things that really matter, on issues that affect the poor and marginalised, whilst those that often clamour for attention are given their proper place amongst competing priorities. There is a real sense of working together towards a clear goal amongst the different elements of a complex church, and more than that, the church is actively seeking out and working with faith and community groups to tackle all kinds of social, economic and environmental problems, some around the corner, others around the world. Congregations are growing in number and in commitment to the purpose of the church, and it is evident that individuals and groups way beyond the bounds of the church understand why St Mary Redcliffe exists, what it stands for, and are grateful for its positive impact on their lives. This is why we are engaged in this huge, monumental, enormous, choose your adjective project, which could see buildings built on the north side of the church, in the south churchyard, and a complete redevelopment of Pruitt Street. It is vast. We are punching way above our weight as a parish church. We are leading on some extraordinary things. And I truly believe that we are able to do that because we understand what our vision is. That our vision is based upon the people of God here in this place listening to the word of God whispered into their hearts and given voice to that, so that we can fully understand why it is that we're engaged in this process, why it is that we are embarking upon this project. Having done some really step back and reminded us all of the deep, deep why of this, let's not forget the more prosaic reasons why we are involved in this project as well. Our toilets are down a flight of steps, unless you fancy using a portaloo. And in the 21st century, as we have the ability to travel to Mars and all the rest of it, really toilets down a flight of steps, it's kind of not good enough. It is impossible to meet anyone, anywhere, within the whole of the church plant, including the vicarage and the offices and here, on level ground in private. We either have to see people in public in the nave, or they have to climb some pretty tight stairs. Level access is a real issue. It's 5 metres from nave level to street level on the north side. But it's really important that we tackle the issue of access. More interestingly, we have some fascinating places that people rarely get to see. I don't know how many went up on the bell chamber tour and on the roof tour on Saturday, but it's one day a year pretty much that we offer the ability to go and see those, and we don't show them the strong room, and we don't show them the processional way, and we don't really show them the Easter vestry room or the Chatterton room. There are so many little bits and pieces of this place that we want to open up so that people can get to see far more of this building than they currently do. And hidden away down in the lost corners of the church are some extraordinary artifacts. In fact, today we found, that's a royal we, Reese found, a piece of fabric that was from a very early altar cloth, The gold metalwork around it is probably 1600s, and the velvet is probably original, kind of earliest velvet that there is. It's not in good heart, and we're taking it over to the parish office to look after it a bit. It's probably Genoese, and it's probably from the time of Cabot. That's what we think. And it was lounging down in the strong room amidst other bits and pieces where they're not being very well looked after. The vestments that we have, some of the most important sets of vestments that we have are again down in Canning's kitchen, where the humidity isn't right for them to be stored, and we're looking to do something quite urgently about that. But we have a collection. There's a collection by Mrs. Fry, not the chocolate lady, which is shared between here and the cathedral, and apparently, I'm told, it's a really important set of vestments. And we have other bits and pieces, like a fire engine. I do want my fire engine back, which it's just a kind of interesting to have those bits and pieces, and that we should have them back here so that people who visit can go, why on earth does a parish church have a fire engine? But the heritage aspect of all this is only one aspect of it. Those of you who have been sitting on PCC for the last 3 years will know that we are equally focused on ensuring that whatever we do within the heritage strand is mirrored by what we do within the community strand. It's much more complicated, the community strand, because lots of people are coming to the table. The conversations are very exciting, and I'm hoping that within a fairly short time I shall be able to tell you that we have X number of people sitting around the table, the landowners, the major users, and interested parties from outside the area, the universities, some major funders, some philanthropic organisations, all working together to see what can we do about Pruitt Street. There's a lot of people very, very interested in Pruitt Street, and including a lot of the sites that are currently used for one purpose. We're beginning to wonder about whether we might be able to turn those into different purposes. I think I need to kind of draw a bit of a veil over that in public at the moment. I don't know. Watch this space. But I can assure you that we are not neglecting the community aspect of this project in order to push forward the heritage aspect. The thing about the heritage aspect is that we kind of know what the direction of travel is. We know that if we do this and get that right, we then move on and do this, we then do this, we then do that. And there's a fairly straight path which is fairly well worn by other organisations on a heritage project like this. Pruitt Street is unique. And we're bringing together a very disparate group of interested parties, and so it looks as though, it might feel as though there's not much happening at the moment, but I can assure you we haven't taken our eye off the community strand. And then of course we remember that all this is done in as part of, or egged on by, the potential development of Redcliffe Way. Hoping, anticipating that the dual carriageway, the car park and the roundabout will soon disappear and be replaced by an urban village on our doorstep. Don't worry too much about what this looks like. It's just a picture to give you something to look at instead of listening to me. But I do think that is likely to happen now. I think times have changed, and with the amount of development work going on around Redcliffe, if you think of what's happening at Wapping Wharf, at the General Hospital, and Redcliffe Wharf is now under discussion for development, coming in from that side. Coming in from the north, you've got that huge expanse, laughingly known as Redcliffe Village. And then on the Temple Meads side, you've got the arena, Temple Meads, Temple Gate. The pressure on this little patch of prime real estate is going to be enormous. It's going to go and it's going to get built out. The question is whether the City Council will hold on to its aspiration that it will get built out in conjunction with the local community forum, or whether some developer will come along with such an enormous cheque that the City Council just can't say no. We're going to have a whole new development right on our doorstep in the next few years. We've no idea what it's going to look like, but it's going to be part of our parish, it's going to be part of our neighbourhood. And it's really important that we embrace that process, and we are very much at the heart of that, of what's going on with the Redcliffe Way development. All this is being led by a project board that has been brought together by myself and a few other people. It has been mandated by the PCC to take forward the project so that it can move forward in a timely fashion. And we have been extraordinarily fortunate to gather some very, very significant people from around the city. Mike Bothamley, many of you will know, he's a vestry trustee and also a land lawyer working at DAC Beechcroft. Andy Street is a major consultant. He was one of the founding directors of SLR Consulting, and he's also a Christian social entrepreneur. Anything that happens in the social enterprise, Christian social enterprise field in Bristol, you won't have to dig very deep to find the name Andy Street. Christine Froud is the Archdeacon of Bristol. Ned Cusson, many of you will know as the quantity surveyor to the vestry and works for Jones Lang LaSalle. Me, David Alderman is the circuit superintendent for the Methodist Church in this area. Marcus Chantry, our not inspecting architect, our conservation architect. Samantha Mant used to work in the field of professional fundraising, worked on Bristol Zoo and a number of other projects over the few years. She's now given that up and is working on her own businesses in plumbing. I'm not sure of the link, but there must be one somewhere. But she brings the skills that she used when working as a fundraiser to the table. Marion Derber, our church warden, Mary Nichols as chair of the vestry, Peter Floyd as a former member of the vestry and a town planner by background. Richard Bonner works for Arcadis. He's the city director for Arcadis, which is this is where my language kind of runs out on me. I'm not exactly sure what they do, but he's a jolly, jolly good chap. And he's got a keen eye on making sure that the money in the spreadsheet kind of lines up and adds up. That's where his skill set comes in. And Richard James, our other church warden as well. So it's an excellent group of people who sit around the table. We all know that not that long ago we had an architecture competition, and out of the expression of interest we had some 55 firms from around the world who expressed an interest in bidding for this work. We shortlisted 5, we interviewed them, and out of those 5, having gone looking around the world for an architecture firm to work with, we found them in King Street, opposite the Bristol Old Vic. I mean, it's a wonderful piece of kind of synchronicity, in that sense of we are stone's throws from one another, and they have a huge personal investment in Redcliffe as a place, and this, making sure this project really works well. So at this point I'm going to hand over to Dan Talks, the lead, no, to Niall Phillips, who is the director. I know it's going to be Niall because he's got the microphone on. I'm going to give my microphone to Dan. It's Niall Phillips, the director of Purcell, who's going to come and pick up from where I've left off, and then after that Dan Talks, who is our lead architect, and after that we'll have an opportunity for question and answers. Niall. That will just work.
It will just work.
Yeah, theoretically.
Can everybody hear me? Good. Well, quite a...
Not really. If the oh, no, I think maybe not been switched on. I'm still on. Try now. Huh? Yeah.
Can we go backwards? Good. Sorry about that. Slight technical hitch. I don't think I've ever been in a space where my voice sounds so loud. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life first. I was born in Lawrence Weston, and then in very bad taste my parents moved to Birmingham, so I was brought up in Birmingham. But I came back here to college to study architecture on Great George Street at the age of 18. I'd left when I was 2, but coming back to architecture school, I absolutely loved it here. When I was 4 years old, when my brother was being born, I was shipped off to stay with my grandmother in Cardiff, and it's my first and most vivid memory of childhood. She took me on a bus on a sunny September day, probably this time of year because my brother was born on September 16th, to a place called Castle Coch. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but it's a magical Victorian recreation of a fantasy castle. And I remember getting off the bus, walking up the drive in this dappled sunlight, these amazing trees, coming round the corner, and there was this most wonderful, wonderful fantasy building for a 4-year-old boy interested in knights and swords and things like that. And I date my interest in architecture to that day with my grandmother. I was so enthralled that she then took me to Cardiff Castle, to some of the first buildings that were built at St Fagans. So my interest in architecture, particularly old architecture, started very early in my life. I came to Bristol University. I did my 5 years here. I tried a year in London, didn't like that. I tried a year in Devon, loved that, but couldn't make a living. So I ended up back in Bristol. So for some 35 years of my working life, I've worked here in Bristol, mostly in King Street, just round the corner. Every day I pass St Mary Redcliffe 2 or 3 times, sometimes more. Today I've walked to the station and back and come to work, so I'm probably around 4 or 5 times. So for me, St Mary Redcliffe is the sort of pivot around which Bristol revolves. It's, for me, the most visible symbol of the town. There isn't. The cathedral's sort of tucked away on the side of College Green. The centre is, well, it's the centre. But St Mary Redcliffe, it's, as I say, a beacon, a pivot around which city life revolves. As part of our involvement in this project, it's become very clear to me that that's not unique to me, but actually it's the story of the church from its very early conception. And I read with great interest about how the sailors who were setting off into the Atlantic in such rickety, crude and simple boats in the 15th century to go to places like America came here when they departed and said a prayer in the north porch and then left. So it was clearly as pivotal for them in the 15th century as it has been for me today. So, of course, when I and my colleagues saw the advertisement for an architect for a new project for St Mary Redcliffe, we were straight in there. We whacked off an email and waited with great interest for the documents to arrive. I say that because architects are often criticised for, flitting, doing a building that nobody likes and disappearing off into the dust. We are here, we're based here, and we're going to live with this building certainly for the rest of my life and my professional life, and even more so for Dan. So this has, from the outset, been a project of extreme interest to us and great value, not in financial terms at all, but in terms of the interest and engagement it gives us in the project. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we do, I think. Sorry.
The one on the right.
Ah,
Yeah.
right. Good. Our practice is called Purcell. It used to be called Purcell, Mill and Tritton, but that was too much of a mouthful, so a couple of years ago we chopped it down to Purcell. We've been going for just over 65 years. I'm not sure the sums. We were founded in 1947, and we were one of the very earliest conservation practices in the country. We have quite a few offices all over the country, and projects like St Mary Redcliffe are the ones that are at the very core of what we do. We do a lot of projects involving church work. So we have worked recently at Wells, where we built the new choir school and the new visitor centre, my colleague Chris Cotton. We're working at Ely Cathedral. We've just finished a project at Durham Cathedral called Open Treasure, which is actually quite similar to yours. It's opening up the cathedral's hidden treasures, things that they have in the basements and in the store cupboards that people don't see, for people to see. We work at Ely. We've been cathedral architects for St Paul's, Canterbury. We are currently cathedral architects for Canterbury. All our work in this field is about our respect for the buildings that we work on. These buildings, particularly St Mary Redcliffe, are the most phenomenal things. Designed, built before the age of power tools and computers and all that, but nevertheless quite stunning, something that we couldn't do today, no conception of it. So we approach them with a great feeling of responsibility and privilege. A lot of our work in Bristol is with third sector organisation, voluntary groups, charities, congregations of churches. Charities, and you'll know this yourselves, don't have a lot of money, but you often have very big ideas. So one of the things that I've specialised in since working on things like Barton Camp when I was a student is trying to help people with big ideas but no money, raise the money to do the big ideas. So naturally, when things like the Heritage Lottery Fund were founded, we got straight in there and tried to raise from the Heritage Lottery Fund and the other lottery funds for our projects and our clients' projects. We've done some very interesting things in Bristol. A lot of you will know Arnesvale Cemetery, a great cause of great anguish to many of the people who lived in Bristol. We worked on it for nearly 20 years, from an initial feasibility study through to setting up the trust that eventually took the project on, through raising what was then £10.5 million in cash to help do the project, and then carrying out the works. And if any of you go to Arnesvale, it's a great place to go. It's full of interest, full of interesting things. We do lots of museums. So the top is Tudor House Museum in Southampton. We've recently finished Cardigan Castle, a derelict castle built by Lord ap Rhys, the last of the kings of Wales. Again, for a very small community group and a very ambitious project. Currently we're working on the new room, building a new archive and library at the back. We're building Cornwall County's new archive. So all of these projects are funded by the HLF, and it's a major part of the work. I often say to my colleagues like Dan, once we start the drawings, the job's nearly done, because it takes so long to raise the money to get that far. A lot of our work involves doing new buildings in very sensitive locations. So for example, this is a little cafe that we built poking out over the walls of Cardigan Castle. We did a new visitor centre at Cardiff Castle, buildings like Tudor House Museum, a little cafe and a new visitor building. So we do a lot of work where the buildings are in a historic or environmentally sensitive context. The Wells Cathedral project is a very good example. All our work, when we do it like that, is contemporary. You can't build a building next to St Mary Redcliffe in the style of St Mary Redcliffe. We would just disgrace ourselves. We could never design something as magnificent as this. And we have to use a vocabulary that we have today in our modern world to try and make something that resonates with the buildings that's there and has a new purpose and function. I'm going to let Dan have a little talk now, and I'll come back to talk to you about the mechanics of this project in a short while.
Okay, thank you. So Niall has he's referred to the fact that we're the local architects, that we have very relevant expertise. He's also touched upon the fact that, of course, we have a very personal interest in the project. As a number of you are aware, that couldn't be truer than in my case. When I first arrived into Bristol to work for Niall many years ago, I lived in Redcliffe. My first experience of the city was stepping off a train at Temple Meads and the confusion of not knowing whether to turn left or right. Struggling with the legibility of this place. I lived in Caxton Gate, and for the entire time that I lived in Redcliffe, I didn't have the confidence to actually enter this building. And I think when we've spoken about the cathedral-like scale of the church, the fact that whilst it's incredibly majestic as a building, perhaps that conflicts with its role as parish church, that was exactly my experience. In addition to that, within our team, Rob Gregory had a key role in the Redcliffe Neighbourhood Forum, and both Rob and I have taught projects through our academic roles that were based in Redcliffe. So Rob through the University of Bath and me through the Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff. So the opportunity to test those ideas for real through the competition was a pretty amazing one, really. Our competition process was certainly enthusiastic, it was engaging, it was exploratory. It was also pretty exhausting, I have to say. But through that process, we identified three key themes that I think we carry into this stage of the project. Thank you. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, as Niall has said, we work in a number of historic environments. That's really our specialism. And as architects who work within those environments, we're acutely aware that our work exists within a continuum. For many of the sites that we work on, our contribution is a tiny fraction of the overall history of a site. And that reinforces in us the sense that really our role is one of custodian. In that sense, we acknowledge that we have responsibilities both to the memory of the past and the aspirations of future generations. And the theme of memory is very important to us. I don't think that slide's particularly clear, but one of the concepts that we brought to the project was this sense of remembering this place. The three images at the bottom are historic images of the north side of the church. During our design process, we surrounded ourselves with these historic images. And what we found particularly fascinating with those was the very close juxtaposition that once existed between the urban grain of Redcliffe and the church itself. The images, they acted as a reminder to us that what we see now, the entire exposure of the north elevation, is actually a relatively recent factor in the church's evolution. And in some ways we felt that those images, they typify the disconnection that exists between the church and some members of its community. The church has become isolated as a consequence of the evolution of Redcliffe, and that is something that didn't always exist. The image then that sits above it is, to use a sort of grand term, a palimpsest. What it actually is tracing over a series of historic maps and then overlaying them. And the purpose of that was to again identify what had existed in this place prior to Redcliffe Way and the widening on Redcliffe Hill. What was the nature of Redcliffe as a place? And from that piece of analysis, we identified three key moves, really. The first of those lower of the dashed lines was the historic boundary of the northern churchyard, and we were very keen to re-establish that sense of medieval enclosure. Then running north to south, the historic alignment of Pump Lane, and then finally the lines that run east-west, the historic alignments of Pyle Street. To that sense of memory then, we added the need to reconnect. As I said, I lived in Redcliffe for a number of years, and during that time I experienced the difficulty of actually just getting into the city. The fact that the place is severed by roads, it's tended to be dominated by traffic, and particularly in the case of the church, it's often described, isn't it, as the finest church on a traffic island. Unfortunately, it has that sense. It is a building that has been disconnected by the network of roads around it. We discussed how the church feels like it exists on a fault margin, how it occupies that very key pivotal position between North Redcliffe and its relative affluence, and South Redcliffe, which is beyond dispute one of the most deprived areas within Bristol. It felt to us that a key component of this scheme was to begin to repair that fault margin, to somehow enable the church to take its role in solving those issues. Sorry, can we move on now? Sorry. And so the very crude sketch that you see there is, it was the sort of typical architect's drawing on a napkin, our very first response to the site. But what it's suggesting is that there exists the opportunity to have two key axial connections. Effectively, they're stitches. They are the acts of repair. The stitch that runs east-west is, again, about reintegrating the church with its historic context. So understanding the church's position relative to Redcliffe Wharf, the caves, the Hermitage, Quaker burial ground, and then ultimately Chatterton House. The north-south stitch we refer to as more of a community stitch. It's about understanding how there are a series of spaces that could be linked to forge a much stronger connection between the communities of North and South. So particularly the Redcliffe Children's Centre, the school, Somerset Square, the Ship Inn, the space outside of the Ship Inn and its potential to form a community square, the church itself, and then Thomas Street. And what we felt was that in creating those dual axes, we stimulate a new crossing, a crossing that isn't centred here, but is actually slightly displaced to the north of the church. It becomes a new place and an opportunity for a new community focus around the church. Next one. The last of the concepts then was representing the local materiality. We're conscious that there exists a wonderful story of the industrial processes that once occurred within Redcliffe, and in many ways they've been lost. We were very keen to ensure that our building was able to draw on those. So the three images at the base of the slide, you can see the pottery that once existed on Redcliffe Wharf, the glassworks along Pruitt Street, and finally the Redcliffe Caves, where I spent a few enjoyable hours on Saturday as part of Open Doors. As the slide says, we were keen then that our building should reflect pottery, glass, and also the sand extraction. So in terms of materiality, we looked at the potential to generate a new red base to the building. We proposed it as a piece of hand-worked red concrete. In essence, it's something that would reference very closely the red cliffs, but would be a new and contemporary material. It's something that would reinforce the identity of this place as Redcliffe, and it would quite deliberately root the building in this context. Above that then, we proposed a series of lanterns, effectively, lighter pieces of architecture, slightly more ephemeral, and crucially, items that would be luminous. Dan has referred to the sense of beacons. We felt that the opportunity existed within the architecture to generate literal beacons, luminous volumes that express the hope and ambition of the community and the accessibility of the church to the people who need it. And so this was one of the competition images that I suspect many of you are familiar with. In forging our north-south connection, we proposed 3 buildings. We felt that whilst the brief implied a building on Pruitt Street and a building on the north side, the gap between those 2 buildings was still too great, and the stitch that we were trying to achieve, it needed to be a sort of closer weave. So hence the South Churchyard building as well. The general distribution of the scheme is then we have a community focus within Pruitt Street, but actually we wanted for those community strands to run through. So some of the community facilities are located in the north-south building. That's really to achieve the sense that neither of those buildings would be exclusive. Instead, they would work together in the way that we hope that there would be a collaboration. Then the north side building has a very permeable and easily accessed lower floor, which is again about invitation. And you can see how it respects the alignment of the historic Northern Churchyard. And crucially, it creates this new space, a new community square against the church, which enables new ways of seeing the church. The issue that I found when I lived here of the building almost being too large, too threatening. I didn't feel like I actually had sufficient status to access the building. Well, it begins to reduce the scale of those components. It allows for people to engage with the building in more relaxed ways. Obviously, all of the competition entries, they received fairly strong comments, and we were aware that our scheme did as well. The point that we made at interview, and it is something that I absolutely believe in, is that the competition was not the end of the process, it was very much the start. And the crucial phase that we've now entered is having the ability to speak to Dan, other members of the church, yourselves as congregation and community, to understand what the actual need is for this building. Thanks, Noel. And so we're beginning to do things that we didn't have the opportunity to do through the competition process. One of those is to explore the collection. As you've heard, Reese is doing sterling work in fairly dark corners of the church, identifying objects that many of us didn't know about at all. Also finding objects that perhaps exist elsewhere but could be brought back to the building. And key to this really is identifying the stories that we feel this building should be able to tell. Clearly, the narrative of St. Mary Redcliffe is incredibly rich, an extraordinary story. And in Canning, Cabot, Coleridge, Penn, Chatterton, and of course Elizabeth I, we've got some pretty good characters. So there's the opportunity now to weave this into the architecture, to actually understand how we can best tell these stories, how we can best accommodate these exhibits. And on that subject, I'm going to hand you back to Niall, who will talk to you about Hogarth.
Dan's 6 pictures of characters in the history of St Mary Redcliffe is only a tiny fraction of the people who've been involved here. All people of great importance in their worlds. And you'll know that Hogarth was one of those too, one of the greatest painters of the 18th century, the last of the great Baroque painters. You'll also know that Hogarth was commissioned to paint a triptych for the church here. He came and measured it up, went away, and about a year later came back with the triptych, found that actually he'd got his measurements wrong and it was too big to fit, so it had to be manipulated into the church. It's, if you go to see it in St Nicholas Church over in the market, it's actually in a very sad condition. The museum that was there is closed. The Bristol Archaeological Service that inhabits there at the moment is being moved out, so it's all in disarray. The roof leaks, and poor old Hogarth's wonderful painting sits there in its glory in this rather sad state. It's an incredibly important painting. It's one of what's called the history paintings. And if I can point out, the pointer's not working. You'll see it tells the story of the resurrection, the emptying of the tomb and those things. It's a very valuable painting historically. It's also valuable financially. It's one of the many treasures that help tell the story of St Mary Redcliffe and the worlds that it's lived in. And there's an opportunity to bring it back. The city have to move it, and there's a real opportunity to bring it back here. So we've been working, looking at all the collections to see what we might put in the jewel box of a new building that we might build that helps achieve the purposes of telling these wonderful stories that you have. As Dan said, for us the competition's a slightly odd thing. We're not allowed to talk to you when we're doing it because that would be unfair against the other competitors. We can't talk to the public whilst we're designing it, so we can't actually talk to the people to whom the building really matters. So the competition is a means to an end. And as far as we're concerned, as Dan said, it's only the start, the very, very start. And in many respects, we now put it aside to explore the stories. We're doing here a whole series of brief exercises, looking at what spaces you really need in the building, how big they might be, what size they're going to be, what they feel like, what they look like, and setting it all out in a great long list so that we have mapped it and got it in our heads. We are very anxious that once we start the design process, beyond the competition, that we don't do it in isolation from the people who are going to live and use and hopefully love the building when it's finished. So we will use lots of different techniques. This was at the top left as we ran a program in one of the primary schools in Cottam during the Olympics, and we had all primary school children building their own versions of Olympic stadiums that we then showed to their parents. So the process will be a very iterative one with you as a community, with the people who regard themselves as stakeholders. We hope that when we're doing the work, we'll be able to have the opportunity for people to come and see the works in progress. Watching builders work is actually quite a fascinating thing to do. The bottom left-hand corner is a little lad on the roof of Dereham Park in Gloucestershire, which we re-roofed recently, and we put a lift on the scaffold so that the public could go up and walk round the top of the scaffold. So it allowed this little chap with his protective gear to look at one of the great eagle urns that sits on top of the roof there. So not only is the design process going to engage people in it, we hope when we build it there'll be that same engagement so that people from the school can come and take part and learn those sorts of things. So lastly, I'm just going to say very briefly where we are in terms of the funding. As Dan said, there are two components to the project, a community component and the heritage component. We hope that they will be seamlessly interlapped, but there are two quite different sources of funds that will work towards each project. The big lottery will help towards the community elements of the project, along with a mix of other funds. And we are, indeed, before we start the main redesign of the building, we are just about to start looking at the Pruitt Street area and building up a physical picture of what we might do in Pruitt Street that helps us access the big lottery funds. In parallel with that, we are developing our mutual bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund. You'll know that the Heritage Lottery Fund was set up in 1995 by John Major, and it basically gives money to good causes that are looking after our heritage and providing public access to the heritage. We were all set to make what's called a major grant bid in November this year, which is actually a very expensive activity. It's going to cost in the region of £100,000, £120,000. And then the lottery saved your bacon. At the end of January, it came out with a new funding scheme called Resilient Heritage, which is targeted at people starting a project. So it's helping you fund the early stages of work. So we're busy producing a submission for that, which will go in, we hope, in the first week in October. And that will give you the resource to start in detail the redesign, the development of the design of the new building. It's a very competitive process, bidding to the lottery. I was at a meeting today when there was the last lottery meeting, there were £55 million worth of bids for projects, and they only had £19 million to give away. What that means is that we have to make our submissions to both the big lottery and the Heritage Lottery Fund as compelling, as detailed and as worthy as possible for accessing those funds. So we'll be putting a huge amount of effort in that over the next 3 to 4 months to make sure we do that. So thank you for your time. I think Dan's going to finish off now. Yes?
I think we're going to go into questions, haven't we? I think you might have just misspoke at one point when you said the Resilient Heritage Fund came in January. It actually came in on the 1st of September. So we were introduced to it yesterday at 5 to 5. And we're going to get an application in within 4 or 5 weeks of this opportunity being provided by the Heritage Lottery Fund. It's going to be quite a significant piece of work in its own right to get everything ready for that. But it's clearly the right thing to do in order to get us in the right place for the major grant application, which will now happen sometime in 2017. I have entirely forgotten what it was that I was going to say at this point, if I'm honest. So, whilst I'm thinking of that, Andy has a microphone. I still can't, I can see on a bit of paper in my head, but I can't remember the last line. Andy's got a microphone, and we're going to take questions now, whether they're for me or for Dan and Niall. If you have questions, have a little chat amongst yourselves, as that's what you do in these situations. Turn to your neighbour and have a chat, and then in a minute or two I'll have remembered what it is that I was supposed to say, and then we can do questions and answers. I've remembered what it was, and that is simply to ask you again to contemplate the stuff that is part and parcel of the story of this amazing place that we call Redcliffe. I don't just mean Sir Mary Redcliffe, but Redcliffe in its whole entirety. And if you know of anything that would be of interest to enabling us to tell our story better, please don't assume that we know about it already. There is so many things out there that we don't know about, and I would much rather to be told the same thing 3, 4, 5 times than for everyone to think, oh, they must know about the whatever it is. Yeah. That was the line I was supposed to end with, and then say, and now we're going to move into questions. So Andy's there, and we are seriously here. We're here to make sure you get an opportunity to comment and have those comments heard, to answer the questions that you have, for you to raise your concerns about this project. which we will take them on board very seriously. This is not something we are doing to you, this is something we are doing on your behalf and doing with you. So please do put your hand up and make some comments. Angela.
Okay, so we three have been talking about the issue of how you're going to, you talked about this sort of north-south axis and communication lines and the east-west, but that presumably being able to do that is partly dependent on what the Bristol City Council, developers, etc. are hoping to do. So how are you going to make sure all those things happen in line, please?
You take us right to the heart of one of the main problems with this project, of which there are a number of main problems. Gentlemen. You've got a microphone on here.
Will that work? Oh, it does. That works. That's wonderful. You're absolutely right, and we're acutely aware of that. The competition brief had a slightly vague boundary, I think it's fair to say that. And that's really because it was clearly understood that the issues cannot be solved from entirely within the boundary of the church lands. But I think we're in a very strong position to exert influence, to inspire. It's clear from some of the conversations that Danny's already having with adjacent landowners that if we can demonstrate the potential, then people will begin to buy into the overall vision. I think we can certainly achieve buildings that are of sufficient quality that they will address a number of the issues. But you're absolutely right, that broader vision depends on the inclusion of others. But I think it's absolutely our responsibility to ensure that we don't shy away from that we do recognise the opportunity that exists alongside the Redcliffe Forum, local authority lands, and indeed adjacent developments.
And someone has to go first. So there's a bit of an element of playing chicken here. Who's actually going to put down the first marker that Redcliffe is going to get built out, is going to get developed this time round? We've been waiting 50 years for Redcliffe Way to be redeveloped, and I literally mean 50 years. The oldest document I have seen in the city archives is of a minute with an aspiration approved, an approved aspiration for redeveloping this area, dated 1966. So we just need to keep pushing at this door, and I think the door is becoming increasingly open on this one, and setting a march on quality is as important as setting a march on becoming the sort of the first site that starts to get built. If we can set those tones about build quality, I think that would be really important for the whole of the Redcliffe development. Thank you, Angela. Martin.
Slightly different topic.
No, it's on. That's fine.
A slightly different topic, but I think it's relevant. Just over 3 years ago, there was a 3-day get-together here down in the Undercroft at the Prince's Trust. Now, I'm not sure what came out of that, or whether anything that did come out of it was relevant to this work.
You was at the Prince's Trust things, were you there? No? Rob was there. I wasn't there because I wasn't in post then, so it was a little bit more than 3 years ago now. Time flies. Marcus, were you part of that? Would you like to say a little bit about what happened and where you think that information has gone, if you know?
Well, certainly one of the drawings that you showed up there from the Redcliffe Forum, that drawing pretty much came out of that event, I think, in the discussions that took place. It's certainly of that date and time, and I think it's been the forum have carried on that process that was facilitated by the Prince's Trust, and most of the things are still very valid, I think.
I'm certainly aware that I'm not certainly aware that the work that has been done in various places, like the conference that was held at the Architecture Centre, as well as the Prince's Trust work, and Barton Wilmore, I believe, were heavily involved at some point. A lot of that work has provided what you might call the background library, which has enabled the forum to get itself to where it is today. It's a bit like the fact that since 2003 we've been doing various reports and reviews. So we've now got the conservation plan for the church, for the South Churchyard. We've got heritage plans, we've got facilities reviews. We've done reports on this, that and the other. I think it's a similar kind of situation whereby in order to get to the end point, you need to build that kind of library of information. And as well, in terms of the local community forum, it's also that hinterland of support from local people, but also from other significant stakeholders. Jonathan was going to ask.
Thank you. I may be jumping ahead a bit in the detail, but I was very interested to hear what you had to say about what I could call the museum pieces, which put me to wonder how they will be displayed. And in particular, some of those here who know me over many years, I've been trying to advocate that visitors to the church should have an audio guide to be able to take them round, rather than be taken round in parties. Personally, I'm a lazy sort of person. I don't like being lectured to. I like to have freedom of action, to be here as much as I want about whatever I'm looking at. And so I hope that may be embodied eventually.
There will certainly be awful lot of thought going into how to ensure that the stories that we're trying to tell are accessible to as many people as possible, and the use of audio will be one of the ways that is considered. Whether it's in the kind of sense of one of those things that you hold up against your ear as you're walking around. Technology moved on a long way since then, but we are engaging with people that are experienced professionals in ensuring that we can tell the stories that we want to tell. But thank you very much for that. Do you want to add anything?
It's still on, yes. We've already been discussing that, and part of the bid that we're making to the Resilient Heritage Fund, will include what we might call an interpretation, a heritage exhibition strategy. The stories that will be told can be told through lots of different media, and we want to make sure that it's as accessible and enjoyable for everyone who visits and engages them, and when they go away that they want to come back and see it again. So that's quite an important thing to do fairly early on, because it informs what we then have to design to house it. So that's an important piece of work that we're doing now.
One of my hopes might be that we have this, it's going to be quite a vast space in which to put the Hogarth. And then down the sides, somehow using digital imaging, we recreate the church as it was in 1755 or whatever. Because things have moved around quite a lot at that end of the church in the last couple of hundred years. Things are not in the same place as they are now. And we could then show the altarpiece as it was intended to be, rather than as it actually was, sort of rather squashed in. Even we could possibly then display a Eucharist by using a video projected onto the front of it as it was in 1753. And then you could play Spot the Difference between 1753 and 2016. Any other comments or questions? Richard, I could just wait for the microphone if you would.
I was just wondering about some explanation about the processes moving forward, whether there might be opportunities for design workshops in time to come, and the timeline moving forward.
Well, there certainly will be the opportunity for design workshops. I was trying to explain that through one of our slides. We're very anxious that people get engaged. There's lots of different ways of doing it. As I mentioned at Cotton, we ran a school programme, but we will do at Cardiff Castle. We ran a 9-month programme of design workshops to help all the stakeholders understand why we were putting such a large building in such a sensitive site. I make no bones about it. It's actually going to be a very difficult project, this. There's going to be a lot of people who don't want to see any building anywhere near the church. They'll struggle with the concept that actually, not that long ago, before the space in front of the church was cleared to build the motorway that was going to scythe through the middle of Bristol and cross and through Prince Street, that this was a very, very closely grained area. So putting buildings back into, if you like, the front of St Mary Redcliffe is going to be a difficult thing. The only way you can get over that is to run through a process of consultation and engagement. We need to make sure people understand the decisions that are being taken, the reasons behind them, and why. And the best way for them to understand that is to actually take a part in trying to make them. And so that's the process we're going to do. Our initial stages, we have been wrestling with how we move from a competition entry through to making the major grant bids, because without the grant bids, none of this is going to happen very easily. And so the first part of the process is very much writing rather than drawing. It's actually writing a description to the funders that sells them the project. If we're successful with the Resilient Heritage bid, which we should know by Christmas, fairly soon after that, we would be starting in detail reviewing the design that we produce for the competition. And at that point, we would set in place a structure of workshops and engagement activities. We don't want people just to come and look at boards and tick it and say, yes, we like it. We want them to help figure out what goes on the boards for them to see. And that's an important part, in our view, of the commitment to making this project very much at the heart of the community here.
Angela again.
This is a Brexit-like question. This is a Brexit-like question, the one the government didn't ask themselves. What happens, what are you going to do if the Heritage Fund says, the Resiliency Fund, and then the Heritage Funds say no? Right, okay.
And we'll apply again.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll apply again until they say yes. I have to say, the reality is at the moment, when the Heritage Lottery Fund has a major bid, it's almost certainly going to have to turn it down at the first occasion, simply because the volume of bids is so high. The resources, although very generous, the Heritage Lottery Fund, are limited, and they have to look at the priorities of the projects coming forward. We have most of the projects we're involved in are failing at the first attempt, but being approved at the second attempt. We have a number of projects like Penarth Pier Pavilion that took us 3 goes, and we've got one which actually took us 4 goes before we got the money, Highcliffe Castle in Dorset. So I'm very hopeful that being a new fund, and if we're first through the door with our bid in the end of September, not more than 4 or 5 weeks after the fund's opened, we might have a better chance with the Resilient Heritage Fund bid. And then, although I wouldn't want it repeated outside this gathering, if they start funding the project in the early stages, they're more likely to look favourably at the next stage and the next stage. And of course, the Resilient Heritage helps you build a much better main application. But it's going to be a bumpy ride. It's not going to be easy. Part of that, one of the reasons we want to make sure people are engaged in the project is the lottery are very conscious as to what communities want and need. They listen to what's going on. So when we put the bid in, one of the first phone calls they make is to their press agent, and that press agent gathers all the media, press coverage, paper coverage on the project, and it provided that supportive, that will help the bid through. We were told after the Arnos Vale bid, the Arnsvale Cemetery bid, that got a huge grant, largely because there was such huge community support for it and a great campaign in the Evening Post about the project. So we see the process of engagement as being important to build that support that then is voiced in the wider world that the lottery, their feelers and antennae pick up and then add into their bid process. So it's going to be a long and bumpy road, that part of it.
It's also worth just pointing out, though, that we're not losing the sight of our final deadline. We have a very clear aim point to have a formal opening of any new facilities that we do build here in August 2024. So put the date in your diary, because August 2024 is going to be a serious event across the whole city, because it's the 450th anniversary of the visit of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I to the city. Some call it a state visit. I don't know whether that's correct or not, but I'm sure some of you can tell me that later. But it was clearly a very unusual event for the Queen to leave London and go to the Shires and visit. And she spent a number of nights here. And we're aware also already that there are certain plans in place for the representation of the saddlecloth that she rode on when she was in the city. It's going to be a big event, the 450th anniversary of that visit. So that's what we're aiming for in terms of a formal opening. And our discussion yesterday about whether to put in for this resilience heritage bid, would that knock that date off course? And the answer was very clearly no. So we have some time. We have quite a lot of slack in the system to enable us to go to this major grants bid once, twice, possibly even 3 times without actually losing sight of that deadline of August 2024.
Heritage Lottery Fund money. I mean, if Elizabeth I says it's the best parish church in England, who are the Heritage Lottery Fund to disagree with that and not give you a jolly handsome cheque?
Okay, any final questions? In which case, can I thank Dan and Niall for coming in this evening, and just to kind of go over the why and the what and the how, just very briefly. You're going to go from here with a lot of information that we would be really appreciative of sharing with everybody else within the church and the wider community as to why we're doing this. I mean, if you're talking to people in church, why are we doing this? It's because this is what the church is saying God is calling us to be and to do. If you're talking to people beyond the church, it's because we feel the need to provide facilities for those who come to church, those who visit the church, and those who live in the parish of the church. What are we going to do? Well, as yet we don't know. There's that sense of taking a real step back from the competition entry. The competition entry was an entry to see if, coming back from our point of view, from the church's point of view, it was a competition to appoint a team, not to adopt a scheme. And in the team that we have with Purcell, as I hope you appreciate after listening to them tonight, we have some first-rate brains working on this with a real passion for getting it right and a lot of personal investment in making sure it is right for the long term. And how is this going to happen? With a huge amount of community engagement and a lot of hard work, and making sure that we get as many people on board the bus as we possibly can through all the kind of engagement strategies that Niall has been talking about. Those are the key messages that I would be really, really grateful if you would talk about with people when you're going about your daily lives beyond the bounds of this amazing church building that we are so fortunate enough to call our church. Thank you ever so much for coming tonight. Thank you again to Niall and to Dan. We look forward to working with you over the next 8 years, at least. And shall we just stand and say together the grace as we go on our way? the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all evermore. Amen. And my final point, that it was actually all this hopefully has been recorded on video, and you never know, it might appear on the web. So if you want, if people really take a real interest in what's been said, do point them towards the website where hopefully this video will appear. And as I say goodnight to you, I'll say goodbye to the camera.